A sitting defense minister just admitted his country was a rented state for 20 years, used by the United States worse than toilet paper. This is not a rumor from a rival nation. It is an official confession on the floor of the Pakistan National Assembly. Pakistan didn't just lose a strategic partnership. They admitted they sold their sovereignty for rent, and now the landlord has stopped paying. The statement coming from Khwaja Asif is perhaps the most brutal assessment of Pakistan's foreign policy history we have ever heard from an insider. He stood in parliament and explicitly stated that the United States used Pakistan not just like a tissue paper, but worse than toilet paper, used for a specific purpose and then discarded. He called his own nation a rented state, admitting that for 2 decades they acted like mercenaries, fighting wars and fueling violence solely because Washington was writing the checks. When you analyze this through the lens of realpolitik, you realize this is not an emotional outburst. It is a confession of strategic bankruptcy. For years, observers have pointed out that Pakistan's economy and military strategy were dependent on foreign aid. But to hear a serving defense minister admit that they rented themselves out, that they sold the blood of their soldiers for foreign causes, is unprecedented. He even acknowledged that the bodies of fallen soldiers, men who died fighting these proxy wars, were often not even properly honored or accepted, a trend we saw as far back as the Kargil War. But let's look at why this matters geographically. If you look at the map of South Asia, you have to understand why the United States needed Pakistan in the first place. Geography is destiny. Look at the western border of Pakistan, the Durand Line, bordering Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, but it is also a landlocked fortress. To access it, to supply troops there, the United States needed a gateway. Pakistan was that gateway. If you visualize the supply lines running from the port of Karachi all the way up through the rugged terrain of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa into Kabul, you see the lifeline of the American war machine in Afghanistan. Pakistan monetized this geography. They looked at their map, saw they were the choke point, and decided to charge toll. They didn't fight for ideology, they fought for rent. But the problem with renting out your geography is that once the tenant leaves, you are left with the mess they made. And the US has left. The most shocking revelation in Asif's speech wasn't just about the US, it was about the Soviet Union. For decades, the narrative sold to the Pakistani people and to the Muslim world that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, that it was a holy war, a jihad against godless invaders. Khwaja Asif has now turned that history on its head. He admitted on the floor of the House that the Soviet Union did not invade in the traditional sense. He stated that the Soviet Union came at the invitation of the Kabul government. He called the invasion narrative an American theory. Think about the implications of that. To support this American theory, to earn those American dollars, Pakistan radically altered its own internal structure. Asif admitted that they changed their school textbooks. They changed their national curriculum to glorify militarism and jihad. They brainwashed an entire generation of children not to defend Pakistan, but to legitimize an American proxy war against the Soviets. They manufactured a culture of religious hypocrisy, claiming it wasn't part of their ethos in the 60s and 70s, but was fanned by the state to serve foreign interests. He went further, throwing out massive casualty numbers. He claimed that US policies in the last 30 years have resulted in the deaths of 10 to 12 crore Muslims globally. He mentioned the betrayal of Muammar Gaddafi's son, pointing out that even those who tried to work with the West were not spared. He recalled the desperation of past administrations, specifically mentioning how they celebrated a brief visit by Bill Clinton with excessive festivities, desperate for just a few hours of American validation. So why is this coming out now? Why is the defense minister suddenly speaking the truth? Is it a sudden awakening of conscience? In geopolitics, conscience does not exist. This is about survival. If you look at the current diplomatic landscape, the timing is obvious. India has just secured a trade deal with the United States, negotiating better terms and tariffs. Washington is rolling out the red carpet for New Delhi, focusing on technology, defense, and space. Meanwhile, Islamabad is being ignored. The contrast is humiliating. While Indian diplomats are discussing semiconductor plants, Pakistani leaders are realizing their phone calls aren't being returned. The current regime in Pakistan is facing immense domestic pressure. They are accused of being American puppets. To counter this, to save their political skin, they have to resort to anti-American rhetoric. They have to come out and say, look, we know they used us. We are the victims here. It is a desperate attempt to gain sympathy from a public that is already furious about economic collapse. But we must apply the hypocrisy check here. Khwaja Asif says they were used like toilet paper, but the reality is no country can use you without your consent. Pakistan signed up for this role. They wanted the dollars, they wanted the F-16s, and most importantly, they believed that by becoming a frontline state for the US, they could gain leverage against India, particularly on Kashmir. They had other options. Leaders like Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Dr. Manmohan Singh extended hands of peace multiple times. They could have chosen regional trade, they could have chosen stability. Instead, they looked for sponsors. As Khwaja Asif himself said, sometimes they run to Washington, sometimes to Moscow, sometimes to London. A nation that constantly seeks a sponsor rather than a partner will always be treated like a mercenary. Now let's shift the focus to the India angle. What is the strategic lesson here for New Delhi? This entire saga is a vindication of India's policy of strategic autonomy. While Pakistan was renting its geography to the highest bidder, India refused to join military blocs. India refused to send troops to Iraq or Afghanistan despite American pressure. India maintained its relationships with Russia, with the West, and with the global South based entirely on national interest, not on rent-seeking. The lesson for India is clear. Alliances are useful, but dependence is fatal. Pakistan's mistake was thinking that being useful to a superpower guarantees your safety. It does not. Superpowers have interests, not friends. Once the US interest in Afghanistan ended, Pakistan's value dropped to zero. India must continue its path of Atmanirbharta or self-reliance. Whether it is defense manufacturing, energy security, or economic policy, you cannot outsource your survival. The moment you rely on a foreign power for your daily bread or for your borders, you become a client state, and client states are eventually discarded. The collapse of Pakistan's strategy should serve as a grim reminder. Building a national identity based on hatred of a neighbor and funding that hatred with foreign money is a suicide pact. Today, while we analyze trade deals and GDP growth, our neighbor is analyzing how they were used and thrown away. The geography hasn't changed, but the geopolitical chessboard has completely shifted. Before we conclude, a quick question for you to test your knowledge of this region's history. Khwaja Asif mentioned the Soviet entry into Afghanistan. In which year did the Soviet Union officially enter Afghanistan, kicking off the 10-year-long war? A. 1975, B. 1979, C. 1982, or D. 1989? Let me know your answer in the comments below. In conclusion, the admission by Pakistan's Defense Minister is a tragedy for his nation, but a lesson for the world. It proves that short-term gains from foreign aid can never replace the long-term strength of a sovereign economy. In geopolitics, there are no permanent friends and there are no permanent enemies. There are only permanent interests.